What is up, everybody? It's Dr. Vibe here, host and producer of the award-winning Dr. Vibe Show, 2018 Innovation Award winner, handed out by the Canadian Ethnic Media Association. Also, this is the home of Epic Conversations. I'm the host of Epic Conversations, and remember, you're blessed, highly favored, a magnet for miracles, and a solution for someone's problem. And this is another first for Dr. Vibe because I don't know when I've done a 9 a.m. Sunday morning conversation with anyone, but this gentleman, we make room when we can fit on his tour to do a 9, and he's so humble, but he's doing great work. And I've been after him in a good way for a little while to join us on the Get Vocal platform, and we're very blessed and highly favored to have Anthony Morgan. Let me tell you a little bit about him. He's the lawyer and training development consultant in the City of Toronto's Confronting Anti-Black Racism Unit through coordination and delivery of strategic learning and education sessions to City of Toronto staff. He is responsible for the implementation of the anti-Black racism training and development curriculum based on the Toronto Action Plan to confront anti-Black racism. Before joining the City of Toronto, he was an associate at Falconer's LLP, specializing in the areas of civil, constitutional, and criminal state accountability litigation. He has a special interest in anti-racist human rights advocacy, particularly in the area of anti-Black racism, has appeared in various levels of court, including Supreme Court of Canada, and has also represented the interests of African Canadians before United Nations Human Rights Treaty bodies. In both 2016 and 2017, Anthony was nominated as one of Canada's top 25 most influential lawyers by Canadian Lawyer magazine. As you can tell, I could go on for a while. But also, some of the other highlights I will share about him is that he's a member of Legal Aid Ontario's Test Case Committee since 2017. He provides Legal Aid Ontario with expert independent advice on applications for legal aid assistance for public interest matters. He also holds an LLB and a BCL from McGill University, Faculty of Law. He holds an Honors BA from the University of Toronto in Ethics, Law and Society. Let us welcome back to the Dr. Vibe Show, and also for the first time on Get Vocal, Anthony Morgan. How are you this morning, sir?
I'm doing well, Dr. Vibe. Thanks so much for having me, and I really appreciate your patience and us being able to find this time. It's a bright Sunday morning.
We cannot hear you again, so you may need to refresh for some reason. We're not hearing you. So try the refresh and come back into the... Okay, we're just having some technical difficulties here. Anthony's going to come in now, and we're speaking that he'll be okay.
How is this?
Yes, you're good. So roll in.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Vibe, for having me this morning, this bright Sunday morning, and I really do appreciate your patience and working with me so that we could find this time to have this conversation. It's always a pleasure to speak with you, and certainly an honor when I get the opportunity to be on your show to share a bit about the work that I'm doing and just connect with you.
For many, and my pleasure, the pleasure is always mine. We always keep in touch either via text or other ways, and I'm very happy and proud of all the fantastic work you are doing. A lot of people here, they're seeing it for the first time, either live on the replay. Read a great bio about yourself. Tell us about the young Anthony Morgan before he became this mega.
Well, I don't know how mega he is, but when I was younger, I came up like many other young Black kids in the Greater Toronto area, just trying to find my way, trying to mold a path for myself. When I was receiving all these images of what I could be, that I started to get a sense very early that was quite limiting. So you could be involved in gangs, guns, drugs, or just not seek higher education, or you could be a basketball player, rapper, these kinds of things. And so that's not unusual. I was exposed to many of those images, but luckily enough, I had parents who exposed me to literature that helped expand my imagination about what I could be. And so in particular, I'll never forget being given a book from my mom called Holler If You Hear Me, or the title is Holler If You Hear Me, by Michael Eric Dyson. And at the time I had to have been maybe 14, 15. and it blew open my mind. It's a book about Tupac Shakur, but more than Tupac Shakur. It's about Tupac and what he represented in terms of young black malehood and trying to shape identity. And so that was a major motivator for me, reading that book and seeing who I could be. I didn't have to remove myself from my interests in rap music, in black popular culture, but I could engage it in a way that was more politicized, that focused more on building and supporting black communities in the way Tupac did. And and so that book would really shape my consciousness, and it introduced me to a more critical and deeper understanding of the Black Panther Party. Tupac Shakur's parents were Black Panthers. And so really at the time where I was, my parents were also splitting up at that time. So it was very fraught and very emotionally difficult. But that book really helped ground me because there's just the general anger and angst that teenagers go through at that
Yep.
age. So I'm going through that wave of things. And then my parents are going through this very challenging time. But I was given this book. It intervened in my life at the right time, and I just continued the path and seeing, learning about Tupac, and then the Black Panthers, and then the broader tradition of Black resistance. And I decided, although I wasn't a strong student when I first encountered this book, or this book encountered me, or it just came to me uh, through my mom. It really shaped me and changed how I was being as a student. I started to take myself more seriously, and ultimately decided that I wanted to go to law school, and it led me on a journey to where I am now.
You're leading me to ask and bring the conversation to an area I know that's very near and dear to your heart, your mother.
Yeah.
And I was going to say, who was the driving force in regards to education? And and another thing, do follow Anthony on Twitter, because he has really raised up his Twitter game over the last little while. And family is very important to him. And there's other areas that we could talk about. Criminal justice has been something too that he's talked about recently. I won't get into that. It's up to him if he wants to chat, and maybe that's another conversation. But let's talk about the importance of the mother being in a foundational area of your life.
Yeah, my mom, she continues to be a major influence of mine. She had my sister when she was 17. So my parents were teenagers, and they had my older sister, Tony Morgan, and had me when they were in their early teens, and then I have a younger brother, Emil, early 20s, and then they had my younger brother, who's just 4 years my junior, not too long after that. And they, as young people do, you think about who you were. Many of us, when we were between 17 and 23, were going through some things, and they were trying to figure out life while having 3 kids. And so it led to a lot of challenges. Just the very fact that they had kids that young alienated them from their family, and so it put a strain on their relationship. But through that time, my mom has been a huge influence as it relates to having an imagination. I think part of why she sent or shared the book, Holler If You Hear Me, to me, was why she shared it with me, was because she knew that it would help me see beyond the tough circumstances that I was experiencing, that we were experiencing. Just seeing the life of Tupac. His mom struggled with addiction. They lived in poverty, but he continued to have a vision. She continued to push him. And my mom, and we dealt with different challenges, but the challenges no less. And so my mom continues to be a motivator and a guide as it relates to keeping a broad sense, and a vivid sense of imagination of what could be possible for Black people. And so it's inculcated with me, and she's inculcated with me in me a love for reading about our people, a love for study, and a love for speaking and engaging about the experiences of Black people. And my dad too has been a motivator, but it's been a different kind. He's certainly been he's been a force to say, make sure you do the things that you need to do, be responsible as a young man, get your education and such. But I think where it was the creative elements of myself that leads me to try to reach and engage people in different ways through my writing, through my speaking. My mom continues to be a major factor in that.
Yeah, I find it absolutely fascinating that she gave you that book at 14 years old. If I ever get the honor and pleasure in meeting your mother, I would love to just hear some of her story and her with the foresight. And I say, I would love to ask you just why did you give your son that book at that time?
Mm-hmm. I think
That's a story in itself. That
I'm
is
sure it
fantastic.
is. Funny enough, I'm realizing I haven't asked her. I should probably ask her because the book has been so influential for me.
Yeah, I think you, and I'm gonna throw out something to you. If you ever ask her, please write a post about it.
Yes.
No, I'm serious because I know you're creating content and sharing content. I think that'd be a fascinating post.
Thank you for the suggestion. I think I might just go right back and ask her. Like, what was that about? What was that
There you go.
about?
What obviously she provided some foundation about social justice and law. How did you like? Was it her that pointed you in the direction of law? When did you make that decision to go down the law/social justice journey?
So it was around the end of high school. I was in grade 12, so my final year of high school, and it was through this journey again. This book, I might be belaboring the point, but it really was influential. And why is because so that book, Holler If You Hear Me, introduced me to another book, Seize the Time, which is a book written by Bobby Seale, who was a
Yes.
co-founder of the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense. And in that book, Bobby Seale talks about Huey P. Newton, the other co-founder of the Black Panther Party, and probably the person most people are familiar with in terms of the foundational history of the Panthers. And Huey P. Newton had gone to law school for at least a year, and he deliberately had gone to, well, he jokingly would say to be a better criminal, but what he ended up actually doing was to take that information that he gained in law school about the U.S. Constitution to learn how to protect the lives and bodies of Black people in Oakland, California. Black communities were being subject to all kinds of police brutality um, uh, with impunity, where police were just engaging in all kinds of hostilities. But Huey P. took that information he gained from law school, gone back into communities, and educated his brothers and sisters within the community and said, okay, here's how we're going to protect ourselves. Here's what we can legally do, legally we can't do to make sure that we are keeping these police in check because there's nobody else out here to protect us, so we have to protect ourselves. So when I was coming up as a teenager, that blew my mind. That's something that you could do with law. So in that at that formative time, I said, you know what, that's exactly what I want to do. I want to get a legal education so that I can learn how to better protect the rights and lives of Black people, and I
Wonderful.
continue that.
That is great. Thanks. Well, let's get to the main part of our conversation today about the International Decade for People of African Descent. And I have a feeling that most of the people, well, not most, a number of people who are watching this live on replay don't even know that this exists. So, could you give a little background about the International Decade for People of African Descent? How did it come to be?
Sure. So it's been a long journey. I haven't been a part of all of it, but you can go all the way back to the Durban conference in South Africa in 2001, and then there was the Durban Declaration, and it created momentum. So that was a point at which countries came together to really speak in depth about the histories of systemic racism, including slavery on global Black populations or global African populations. And so from 2001, there were several iterations and conversations about, okay, how do we, as a global community, properly recognize the injustices that have been faced by Black communities across the world, but also rectify them. So fast forward to 2011, the United Nations declared that year the International Year for People of African Descent, and that pushed the conversation to ultimately end up declaring the years 2015 to 2024 the International Decade for People of African Descent. So now we are currently in the International Decade for People of African Descent that's been declared by the United Nations, and it has as its theme recognition, justice, and development. And with the passing of the International Decade, it's not just the declaration, but it also includes what's called a program of activities. And so there are a number of things that the United Nations is calling states to do to recognize the International Decade, and particular interventions in the areas of healthcare, housing, education, and employment. So the United Nations is calling on states to undertake different projects, activities, campaigns, educational and awareness initiatives to make sure that we are recognizing again the power, place, contributions of Black communities across the world to rectify historic injustices. And one of those calls includes reparations and exploring different ways in which states can account for the roles that they've played in the underdevelopment of Black communities.
Now, was this, and thank you for the explanation and background, much appreciated. Was this something that countries signed on to commit to? Was this a declaration just given out by the United Nations asking other countries to participate and try to meet the mandates put in the declaration?
So it was the General Assembly of the United Nations that formally adopted it. But as we are countries, so Canada being a country that is a full party of the United Nations, it's considered to have been adopted by Canada as well, insofar as it is a member of the United Nations. So same thing for the United States and the UK, other major countries across the world. And so uh, we have that as a formal declaration of the General Assembly, but it impacts Canada. Canada continues to undertake different efforts to recognize the decade. So in January 2018, the federal government of Canada formally acknowledged the International Decade for People of African Descent. In March 2017, the province of Ontario, the equivalent of a state in Canada, the province of Ontario officially adopted the International Decade for People of African Descent. And then the city of Toronto, where we are, formally adopted or formally recognized the International Decade for People of African Descent in March 2019. So we recognize with those dates that it wasn't at the beginning that Canadian bodies of government signed on to the decade, but I think there's a good amount of momentum where there's increasing recognition, so much so that the federal government of Canada, in its most recent budget, allotted $25 million towards initiatives to support the International Decade for people of African descent across Canada. Now, that's not going to change the world for Black communities. It's not going to go as far as we would like it to go, but $25 million is not nothing. We come from a time where just 2 years ago, there was no talk on the the national level about an international decade at this level. And where there were talks, I don't think they were being taken serious, but through a lot of community organizing, advocacy, focused engagement with decision makers, we've come to a point now where we've gotten $25 million when previously there was zero. And so while I recognize that it's not going to help change all the conditions of injustices faced by Black communities, it's something that we can certainly leverage towards getting to the place where we can make those changes happen.
You, in the title of this conversation, you listed as an opportunity for Pan-African renewal. Where do you see it as an opportunity for Pan-African renewal?
Sure. So when we think about the struggles of global African communities or Black people, one of the things I often like to say is anti-Blackness is borderless. That said, our resistance isn't as borderless as it can be. There are certainly people who maintain a Pan-African ethos, focus, and grounding for their resistance. But for the large part, the major organizing and mobilizations that we've seen have been largely state or country focused. But I think the International Decade for People of African Descent gives us a point of strategic leverage to expand our intellectual, our organizing, our focus more generally on how our struggles are connected to the struggles of African peoples in other countries. And so with a program of activities that the United Nations has adopted with the International Decade, with the different initiatives that other states are undertaking, I think it gives us an opportunity to open our minds, all folks who are engaged in struggle, resistance, and building for Black communities, to think about how activities that we undertake in our respective areas can connect with what's happening in other cities across different borders.
In getting this initiative to level up, to scale up, how much education are you having to do, or are people having to do like yourself about the decade, the push, etc. Is it? Do you find a lot of time you're spending and your others like yourself educating?
Yeah, as it turns out, the notice hasn't gone as far and as wide as it could. And so it does take a lot of work just explaining that we are in the international decade, what it is, its background, who signed on to it, is there money attached, is it uh, uh, just an empty declaration, what does it entail? So there are a lot of efforts that still need to be undertaken. We don't have a lot of time. We're halfway through the decade,
Yeah.
essentially, and so uh, so much more needs to be done to get the word out. And myself, and not myself, not me alone, there have been organizations and individuals, for instance, Emmeline Nicolas, who's based in Quebec, who is a writer, thinker, organizer, activist, who's been doing some great work to increase awareness for populations in Quebec. And there are other great folks and organizations developing in Ottawa, in Halifax, and different parts across Canada. And there's certainly also been some movements in the United States, but at this point, it's still very. It seems that it's still very nascent in the movements and the organizing for bringing this decade to public consciousness. And so, I'm hoping that this conversation can help continue to push the message forward and encourage anybody who has uh, some curiosity about what the International Decade means and is to check out the United Nations website. If you just do a Google search, International Decade, People of African Descent, you could see what it's about, how states are called to implement the decade for Black communities within their borders.
Great, fantastic. You and I know we're based in Canada, but do you have any relationships in regards to this subject in the United States? Do you have communication individuals that you keep up with and work with in the United States at all?
So outright, I'll say no. So where we've been focusing at this point, myself and other organizers that I've mentioned, we've been really trying to get the word up here within the Canadian borders because we had this conversation. How do we connect with folks who are doing the work in the United States? But our approach has been let's get our house in order. Let us actually have a kind of strategic way of engaging this to be able to say, you know what, it's not just us three, four, five, maybe 10 people who are committed to this, but we have whole communities that are committed to having the International Decade properly supported, not only as a local, but a global movement. And so, how do we partner with you in that? And so, we don't have those relationships as yet, but we
Mm-hmm.
are definitely looking at how do we forge those connections so that we can truly make this a global movement. And while I want to say this, while I uh, believe that the International Decade holds tremendous promise for a renewed kind of global African vision for Black liberation, I don't see it ending after the decade. When 2024 ends, I think we will still be of course we will I know I at least will still be working towards keeping an international consciousness for Black liberation. And so this is really a springboard towards a new way of being a global African person in this world. And so I'm hoping that we can use this time for grounding, for connecting, for building to create a foundation for future generations of resistance.
We're talking about Pan African renewal, and where are some areas you feel that Pan African needs to be renewed?
Well, I would say in the conversation, for instance, around resources. So we are based in Canada, in Toronto in particular. And when we look at the Toronto Stock Exchange, we have mining companies that are, frankly, participating very significantly in the underdevelopment of African countries and Caribbean countries. And so would be an area in which we can forge a global consciousness around, okay, whose resources are these? Who's benefiting from it? And how is this impacting how's resource extracting impacting Black communities? And so I think that would be a key area. Climate change itself would also be a major area where we have folks who are the most victimized and disadvantaged by a lack of environmental stewardship, or I should frame it more as environmental destruction in on the continent, but other places where African and Black communities reside. And so this would be another area in which we could stimulate change and focus. Uh, as well as our work against police brutality and systems of state injustice, where almost wherever you look where there are major black populations, you have forms of state repression and police brutality with considerable amount of impunity. So these are just a few of the many different areas in which I think we can create rallying points for the renewal of the Pan-African consciousness. And I want to also be clear in saying that I'm not suggesting that nobody is thinking at a Pan African level. People are doing it. They have been doing it for decades, for generations. It continues. But what I'm more speaking to is seeing how the International Decade offers yet another or a new way that hadn't existed before. So just by virtue of having an International Decade for people of African descent, it creates a kind of renewal. It allows us to think about how states help and hinder our abilities as Black people to build for ourselves and to move towards our liberation.
How has you work with the for the city of Toronto? How has their response been to the decade declaration?
So, like many folks who just don't have a background or understanding, it's been met initially with um, hesitation, uncertainty, but myself and the team that I have in the Confronting Anti-Black Racism unit, under our leadership, led by Miss Anania Ayodele Grant, we've undertaken a strategic campaign to just inform and advise folks on what the decade actually means uh, at the international level, but also what it means to Black Torontonians. So Toronto has the highest population of Black communities in all of Canada. And so, and after getting past those points of hesitation or uncertainty, then the city was on board because they saw that what the United Nations is calling for is consistent with the city's own commitment to bettering conditions of injustice faced by Black communities. And so, recognizing those synergies, we've been able to make some really positive headway, which is why the International Decade was formally recognized by the city not too long after the establishment of the City of Toronto's Confronting Anti-Black Racism unit. We organized ourselves. We touched uh, the right folks in leadership and the mayor himself, and helped paint the picture as to why this is important at the international level, but also at the level of Black communities across the city. The City of Toronto has as its official model diversity our strength. And we regularly recognize in formal documents saying that we are the most multicultural city in the world. And so, in recognizing that and acknowledging that, we said, well, if we want to be true to this, this is one of the ways, recognizing the International Decade and making it real by putting resources towards its elevation, celebration, and the education around the decade would demonstrate this in its truest sense for Black communities and beyond Black communities as well.
In your journey, you've been involved with a number of causes. How has this one been different than other causes that you've been involved with? Are they different or similar?
They're both different and similar, if I could say. So I think it's different in the sense that there's so much less clarity as it relates to what is international law, what are international institutions, what is a human rights treaty body, what is an international treaty. So there are a lot of points of education and learning and growing that are required to give folks the proper context and understanding. So in that way, it's different. Whereas in the local level, you understand there's a police services board, for instance, or there's a school board when there's a form of injustice that you want to redress. We have a general sense of where to go, who to speak to, and how to move, and who the players are. But at the international level, it's very opaque for a lot of folks. It's very removed. It's distant, and so in those ways, it's different. The ways in which it is very much the same, though, is that thinking about how there are international organs, institutions, levers, policies, and laws that we do not always have access to as Black communities. And so in that way, it's very similar in that you know that you have a framework that's supposed to protect you, but it's not always, and unfortunately, it is too rarely protecting you and Black communities. And so having to organize to get Black communities to speak to those policies and work with decision makers, work on the ground, build within communities to create heightened awareness, understanding, and impetus for resistance, for organizing for change for Black communities. So in those ways, it's similar and it's different.
I'm you're giving me some great understanding because I want to know more about this because I'm somewhat involved. Did the UN put any data measurement points in regards to this? Because they put out this declaration, and at the end of the 10 years, is there going to be some measurements on if the objectives have been met? How are things being measured? Are things being measured?
That's a good question. So one of the things that the United Nations has called for uh, as a part of this decade, but also other international treaty bodies have regularly called for is the collection of race-based disaggregated data, which is a critically important thing. So within the United States, some folks might take it for granted that you can figure out how many people have been killed by police or how many people are suffering from being underhoused or experiencing homelessness or rates of obesity or diabetes. Within Canada, we actually do not have a systematized, organized way of having that information, and so the vast majority, the overwhelming majority of our policymakers are making those policies blind. It's not evidence based as it relates to Black communities, and so the United Nations has recognized that this is not something that's unique to Canada. There are many jurisdictions that, because of their hesitation, their fear, their worry about what such data will reveal, they don't collect this information. So the International Decade itself calls on states to implement very robust protocols as it relates to the collection and reporting of race-based disaggregated data. And so the idea is with that implementation, then you can measure change. But we have to get to that implementation first. And so how the change is being measured with respect to the International Decade is whether those commitments are being implemented. Things like race-based disaggregated data or different different reform in legislative structures in the areas, again, of education, employment, housing, healthcare, and of course, what I didn't mention is policing and the justice system. And so by making sure that states, or at least projecting that states should make a commitment towards these mechanisms for monitoring, evaluation, and for creating benchmarks for improvement is a way that's being done. But to answer the question more directly, I don't think there's a
Yeah.
global way that that change is being monitored. I think the United Nations is leaving it to states to determine how they want to assess whether or not progress is being made. That said, one thing that is really promising is that while we have this international decade, which is just from 2015 to 2024, we are currently now in the position where the United Nations is formally committed to implementing a permanent forum on people of African descent. And so the states have to formally vote on it, but there's a commitment to having the conversation and structuring it to determine, okay, we're going to have this permanent forum where we have ongoing conversations to evaluate the progress of change for Black communities across the world. And a lot of people don't know about this process that is underway, but a big vote is about to happen in late June, where states are going to make a formal, they're going to formally vote on what that permanent forum is going to look like. Where is it going to be based? Is it going to be based in Brazil, where there are high populations of Black folks? Is it going to be based in the United Kingdom? Is it going to be based in the United States? Could it be based in Canada? Those are very heated and active debates that are ongoing, and there are significant implications for something like that, where this permanent forum on people of African descent is going to be located. And so this is again a big part of why I'm happy to have this conversation with you, so that people can start doing their Google searches, look at permanent forum, people of African descent, see the conversations that are happening, and see some of the organizing that's being done to make arguments and pitches for the different locations for this permanent forum, and then how it's going to be structured, how often is it going to meet, how long is it going to meet. And again, why I bring all this up is that permanent forum is supposed to be the ongoing measurement for change for Black communities. And so we're really trying to, myself and other organizers are really trying to work with communities to know about the permanent forum and then make arguments for why it should be in one place or another.
Yeah, because we all, especially in the areas that myself and Anthony work in, data is the key now. and especially with a cause like this, because we're starting from ground zero.
Mm-hmm.
and so some people in America or around the world may watch and say there isn't really great race-based data in Canada. It's the
Yeah.
truth. It's the absolute truth, and I'm hoping that the UN really pushes for the creation of data. Now, there's to me a good and bad side of data. Yes, it's great collecting the data, but everyday life for many people of blackness still goes on, and without the data, the policies can't get implemented. So it's a to me a catch-22 situation.
Yeah, definitely. And so, what we often have to remind even policymakers of is that the data always has to be democratized, as in who controls the data is really critical and important. So it's not just hoarding this information and then projecting it in ways that the state feels most appropriate that would stigmatize or reinforce stereotypes about Black communities, but have robust ways in which not only the data is collected, but it can always be accessed by researchers, by community-based organizations, so that they can conduct their own analyses on what's happening with their communities. The data itself doesn't change lives, but it helps us understand how lives are changing and whether or not they are changing. And so the push is really to get that information so we can leverage and say, you know what, based on previous research, we've seen that if you invest, say, $40 million in this project, we can increase rates of employment by X or Y%. We're not even in a position right now to do that. And so by collecting this information, then we can make bigger arguments for resources in strategic ways to push for change.
You have mentioned a word a few times in our conversation today, and I think it's very important. In my conversations with other individuals, I tell them this is the key word push.
Yeah.
I think when I've had conversations with others about the decade, I've told them we just got to keep on pushing.
Indeed. And I'm as you say that, I think about the quote from Frederick Douglass: uh, "Power concedes nothing without a demand." Right? And so we can't take for granted that out of the goodness of folks' hearts, that policymakers, politicians, people in power and influence are going to recognize our humanity. We're going to have to push for it. We're going to have to demand change in an ongoing, strategic, collaborative way that is really based on communities' needs. And although I just mentioned that we don't have systematized, uniform data, there are important there is important research that is out there that shows you the conditions of Blackness across jurisdictions, even in Canada, that would have been conducted independently. And so we do need to use what we do have and continue to push, and also help in doing that pushing, inspire other folks in other jurisdictions to do the pushing for themselves as well. And so that we end up creating this collective push for a new way of being Black in this world.
It's interesting as I'm thinking about the word push and you're speaking about it and sharing about it. It reminds me of Jesse Jackson's Push Coalition. And yeah, I was just thinking, I'm going, yeah, didn't Jesse Jackson have this push coalition? So the word push is very important in the lives of Black, Africans around the world,
Indeed.
not just Toronto, Canada, United States. It's a worldwide situation. What do you feel has been the biggest challenge in making awareness to get engagement in regards to the decade? And I know you can only speak maybe from a Toronto or maybe Canadian perspective. What has been the biggest challenge to get the push to move forward?
I would say the biggest challenge has been the very conditions of injustices that we experience. What I mean by that is that because we're experiencing elevated rates of unemployment, underemployment, high rates of police use of lethal force, police brutality, carding, or what in the American context is more of a stop and frisk kind of engagement with police. Our kids are being suspended and expelled at considerably high rates. We're underhoused or precariously housed. We experience high levels of health inequities. What I'm getting at is the conditions of injustice are so deep that folks are just trying to survive. We're really trying to just get by for the most part. I'm not saying universally. There are Black communities that are thriving, or Black individuals that are thriving. But if you look at data and statistics, it is more common than not that you're experiencing one or more of these kinds of systemic injustices. And so in the midst of that, it's difficult to find time to really think about what does this international decade mean? How does it impact
Mhm.
me? Because I really just need to get through this week. I really need to
Yeah.
just think about how do I get groceries by the end of the week, or how I'm going to pay my rent within the city of Toronto where we are. We have the highest cost of living in the country, and so these are the very real, practical, immediate, material concerns of folks. And so, saying, "Hey, come, let me have you come to a meeting to talk about the international decade," is it's not the easiest thing to do when folks are just really trying to get through their week with themselves or their family, their children. And so that has been a significant barrier. So that's at the level of our community. I would say at the level of like beyond our communities, there is a complacency within Canada. We frame ourselves as this country with this grand tradition of liberation for Black people, that we don't have issues of race. We are essentially racial exceptionalists. So the United States, they are terrible racists. So that's where all the terrible racists are. But in Canada, it's this place of freedom. And so that creates a deep cultural complacency among politicians, among policymakers, among people of influence. And so when you talk about the international decade, they're like, well, why do we need that? We are this multicultural haven where everyone across the world wants to come live and build. And while there is certainly data that shows that many people do want to come to Canada, the other side of that data is that when they come, they experience significant levels of socioeconomic marginalization that doesn't get projected into the media. And so a lot of people end up coming here and being sorely disappointed, or frankly disappeared into the margins of unemployment, of poverty, of struggle, even where they're just fighting for their kids to get through school in a way that is healthy. They're fighting for access to community programs. They're fighting just to be seen at work. And so with all those interconnected struggles, it does end up being a barrier or a difficulty getting to the point where we can raise consciousness around the international decade.
Wow. It seems a lofty task to achieve, and it's not gonna be achieved even at the end of the decade. Uh, what have, and I know you might, I don't know if you do have correspondence. You mentioned Ottawa, Nova Scotia. What, and I know you can't speak for them directly, but how has your communications been with some other groups in those cities in regards to the decade? And are they having similar experiences, similar challenges? What are you hearing from them?
My sense is that they are experiencing similar challenges. One, just the basics of awareness and the mechanics of what this thing is, and then who the players are. And one of the ongoing limitations or obstacles that relate to the international system is, well, who is accountable? So even if we take this international decade thing seriously, who specifically do we speak to about it? Who at the international level, who in the United Nations is looking to make sure we're doing any of this? People don't know. And I will admit that though I'm committed to doing this organizing, I'm not even quite clear on who exactly is responsible for making sure that these states do this work. Now, there is a working group of experts for people of African descent that the United Nations has commissioned, and they play a very important role in making sure states are recognizing and respecting the rights of Black communities. But they're not the body that is holding states accountable. They are more an advisory group that keeps folks informed about different best practices for recognizing the rights and humanity, and supporting and promoting that for Black communities. And so there are a lot of details that still need to be figured out by Black communities, not just here in Toronto, but in Halifax and Ottawa. But instead of getting lost or stopping the resistance and the organizing at that point, what's happened instead is folks have just said, well, we can get to that information, but first and foremost, let us think about how we can leverage this international decade to change the material conditions for Black communities, because that's where the power lies. Because for a lot of folks within communities, the concern about who at the United Nations is going to monitor and oversee that is less pressing and important than how this decade is going to create a push for more jobs or for more access to affordable food, housing, childcare, transit, even. And so that's more been the way of organizing around this. But the message has largely been consistent that, well, people don't know, and then when they know, there's not a sense that there's a genuine commitment because we don't know who has the power to hold states accountable for any of this.
I know you can speak to, and you have spoken to, the response of the City of Toronto government. Do you have any comments on response by these three bodies? The provincial government, and for those in the United States, provincial is like state, and our federal government, which is our national government, and business.
Sure. So I'll say from the outset, I haven't heard any rumblings around the business community, but I think
Interesting.
for businesses, the International Decade um, provides an incredible opportunity. I think for marketing, for demonstrating that you have this commitment to uh, to the betterment of Black communities, and that if you want to expand yourself into global markets, I think having some acknowledgement, even if it's just among your employees, around this commitment to the decade, I think there are opportunities there. The focus of the program of activities that's been adopted by the United Nations does focus primarily on states, but it doesn't exclude the prospect or creative thinking to see how businesses can take advantage of what the International Decade is offers towards making that change. The only government in Canada that has committed direct resources towards the International Decade is the federal government, where they have
Mm-hmm.
dedicated, as I mentioned, the $25 million towards the recognition of the International Decade. And I would hope that other levels of government, at the province of Ontario, where the City of Toronto is, would see that and take initiative. We have school boards, which are a kind of body of local government that have taken on the initiative by formally recognizing the decade. The Toronto District School Board and the Toronto Catholic District School Board, those are the two main school boards within the City of Toronto. They haven't yet formally adopted the decade, but they know about it, and I know that they're active working towards implementing it. So it's a slow going process, and with that lack of awareness and understanding, it is going to be a tough haul. But myself and other organizers, I know you, Dr. Vibe, also in the work that you're doing within community, you continue to push the message. It's really just for us to stay at it, to keep working, to find different ways to spread the word in new and creative ways.
It disappoints me for you to tell myself and our audience that there's only one government in this country who claims to be so multicultural and diverse that has made a commitment, not only by word, well, they've made it by word and they've also put some money behind it. And again, we don't even know how that's going to be after our upcoming federal election.
Yeah.
In regards to that, that's disheartening.
It is. It is disheartening, but again, I go back to the quote: "Power concedes nothing without a demand." I don't think it's on. I don't think it's the sole responsibility of Black communities and allies to fight for this, but because of the histories of anti-Blackness, I think it's reasonable to expect that it will be a fight for us to really push the message and to really navigate and be dynamic and creative and engaging systems of influence and of knowledge creation and consciousness awareness opportunities to help more people know and understand that the decade is here, that we're in it, and that it needs to be recognized for the betterment of Black lives.
And I agree that even this is a great opportunity, whatever the result, for Black communities to work together and win together.
Mm-hmm. And that's
You know,
critically important. That is where also that Pan African vision comes from, or when I think about the renewal. So we have this way too typically of segmenting off parts of our communities, and we are multiple communities. There's not the Black community, but I think this International Decade creates a massive opportunity or prospect for us to come together and say, okay, you've been working with this part of Black communities, you've been working with another part of Black communities. How do we collectively, strategically leverage and use it as a touch point this International Decade for our mutual benefit, as opposed to being in competition with each other? So there are ways in which I'm seeing some of that happen already, and it is really promising. And that's part of why I see the International Decade as a point for Pan African renewal. And also, Pan Africanism is about a consciousness. For many folks who've had the opportunity to read and study it, And so the borderlines of states often also operate within our minds. But the International Decade offers us an opportunity to break down those borders that exist in our very minds that keep us, for instance, sometimes from not working with, for instance, if we're talking about the Canadian context, Caribbean folks not working or doing enough work to build with folks from the continent,
Yeah,
from different parts of the global African continent in strategic and effective ways. And so, again, I'm hoping that the International Decade could be used as that point of consciousness shifting where we can say, okay, there are these borders that formally exist out there, but how do they exist in my mind? And how do I use the decade to break that down? Because there's a borderless experience of anti-blackness that we both have an interest uh, in overthrowing, frankly.
wonderful. Well, I know that you always have things to do and are on the run, and we're coming up to the end here. So, as we wind down our conversation, are there any final thoughts, things you'd like to share with our audience when it comes to the International Decade?
All I would say is I would strongly encourage folks. I don't have the exact URL for you, but the way in which our algorithms work now in technology, you literally just type in International Decade United Nations. You will see a wealth of information that's there. You might also see that your own country has had a visit from the working group of experts for people of African descent, which has happened in the United States and Canada, where a very detailed, specific report has already been drafted on what your specific country needs to do to better the conditions for Black communities. And so there have been several country visits that have been a part of this work towards enlivening the International Decade. So my message would be simply educate yourself, educate, collaborate, elevate. So educate yourselves, then educate communities, then find other people who are doing the same. So that's the collaborate, and then elevate. Look at how you can reach out towards different policymakers, different politicians, but also journalists. Journalists are often looking for new, interesting stories, and so yeah, this is an exact example of it being here, where people want to actually talk about it, not universally, but see who would be a sympathetic or on side journalist or person of influence in media, and try to build that awareness that way.
And just adding on to that, while Anthony was sharing there, I just typed in my search International Decade for People of African Descent right at the top.
All right.
And the website is there. So if there is, you have no excuse, well, unless you don't have online access, which some people still don't,
Mm-hmm.
but people, ask questions, ask Anthony questions, ask myself questions. We may not have all the answers, but certainly we can get your process started in understanding more about this important movement, this important push in going forward. Because I typed it in my browser, it was the first thing, and there's a massive amount of information.
Can I,
Before we let you
do one
go,
last thing?
yeah, please do.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt, but it's just a
No, not at all.
as it relates to the International Decade. One of the things folks often say to me back is, "Well, what are you doing about it?" And it's a fair question. If I'm bringing this information to you, I should be able to tell you what specifically I'm doing. But where I think we have the greatest opportunity for making shifts is by thinking in the frame of what are we going to do about this. And so many folks are a part of different faith communities. They go to different community centers. They work in different workspaces. I think what the International Decade offers an opportunity for is for folks to take the International Decade and go to their different spaces where they already have relationships, and they say, what are we doing about this? What are we going to do about this? Or what is our church going to do about this? What is our mosque going to do about this? What is our community center going to do about this? What is our a folks home going to do about this? What is our sports team going to do about this? So there are so many different ways in which even just the declaration that this team or this organization or this building or this church, this mosque, this community space is recognizing the decade. And also on the website, there are different logos and emblems that you can affix to your work to show that, hey, we are committed to the International Decade. So these are the different ways that you can make it real in your respective spaces. Instead of looking out there to say, what are you doing? Say, what are we doing, or what are we going to do about this?
Yeah, it all starts with you.
Yeah.
Bottom line. And that's fantastic. And just you sharing about different logos and things, I'm going to search on the website to see where I can incorporate that in my communications to outsiders, etc. So, and if I can't find it, I'll certainly be asking Anthony where I can find it. Let me ask, if people want to get in touch with you, how is the best way to do that?
Sure. The best way to keep in touch with me and to follow the work that I'm doing would be via Twitter. That's the main way in which I communicate. I don't have an IG or other forums. I don't really use those platforms. But
No, you're good where you're at, man. Just keep
yeah.
the course. You're very good where you're at.
Yeah. So my handle is Anthony ANTHONY N Morgan MORGAN. So Anthony N Morgan. And you can find me on Twitter and find about all the things that I'm doing to collaborate with other people who share a vision for liberation for Black communities here and abroad.
Yes, and as I said at the front end of our conversation, great follow, great follow. He is, he's he's a Twitter. You're on fire on Twitter. I don't know like how you keep up with. I know how positive productive. I don't use the word busy. How positive productive your life is. So I'm going, wow, respect.
Thank you.
Big time. Absolutely. Well, thanks everybody for watching, either live or on the replay. I am Dr. Vibe, host and producer of the award-winning Dr. Vibe Show, 2018 Innovation Award winner by the Canadian Ethnic Media Association. If you want to find out more information about everything Dr. Vibe, go to my website, the DRVIBESHOW. You'll get all the information you need, a lot of conversations. And if you want to have me host a conversation, if there's a subject you want discussed on this platform and you're too shy to do it yourself, please touch base with me at dr.vibe at the drvibeshow.com. As always, I end my conversations with this: live your life as a dream. If you can dream it, you can make it. Sometimes you have to get small to get stronger. Block assumptions and then aim bigger, aim better, aim higher, aim wider. I'd like to thank everybody for watching the conversation, and please take a look, no matter what your background is, about the International Decade, because one group moves forward, we all move forward.
Sure.
God bless, peace be well, and keep the faith.
Take care.